third cloud, that is probably the darkest one, is the determination of some to actually rock the system that has actually presided over the trade relationships that we have all undertaken and enjoyed to some extent over the last many decades.
Well, NAFTA, look, it's been a terrible deal for the United States. People are starting to see it. We lose over $100 billion a year with Mexico. We lose many, many, many billions of dollars with Canada. Canada doesn't take, I mean, they're very restrictive as to taking our agricultural product and other things. And, you know, all of these countries, including the European Union, they charge 5 times the tariff. We don't charge tariffs, essentially. They charge 5 times what we charge for tariffs. And I believe in the word reciprocal. You're going to charge 5 times, we're going to charge 5 times.
America's always been the most protectionist country in the world for itself. It wants free trade for other countries.
Choosing a trade war is surely the wrong prescription. China will certainly make an appropriate and necessary response.
We will defend our interests if needs come.
I'm convinced that increased tariffs will hurt us all in the long run.
Trade wars are bad and easy to lose.
The Trump administration announced today it will impose tariffs on several of its key allies. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross announced steep new tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. The tariffs, 25% on imports of steel and 10% on aluminum, take effect at midnight. Back in March, President Trump gave the countries temporary exemptions while he tried to force them into concessions, but that didn't work. And now the EU is threatening to retaliate with punitive taxes on U.S. exports like motorcycles, bourbon, and denim jeans. President Trump has said this is all to protect American industry, to protect the American economy. Do economists believe that that is what this does?
No, no economist believes this. I mean, basically Trump's attitude is threaten people with punitive tariffs and they'll give in and give us what we want. So about 2 weeks ago, all the top U.S. trade officials, the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, the Trade Representative, all went to China and made all kinds of demands. We want $200 billion lower tariffs. Gotten absolutely nowhere, and the Chinese are not giving in. They don't want to lose face.
And now, the economists aren't the only ones who don't think that this will work. Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican, came out strongly against it, saying, "This is dumb." That's a quote. And he says that these are the kinds of policies that led to the Great Depression.
Correct.
Is he right about that?
So in 1931, they had the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariffs because things were contracting. It was tariffs on 10,000 products from around the world. All the countries around the world immediately retaliated, exactly what's happening right now, and it led to the Depression. Trade dropped 60% the next year.
We've been mistreated as a country for many years, and it's just not going to happen any longer.
It all boils down in Trump's mind to something called the trade deficit. America has a $500 billion trade deficit, meaning that we buy way more stuff from other countries, especially China, than we turn around and sell to them.
As we all know, America has a huge annual trade deficit with China, a number beyond anything what anybody would understand.
You know, President Trump makes so much of this trade deficit, and it's one of the biggest reasons for imposing these tariffs. But is it as simple or even as big as he's making it out to be?
Well, he seems to have a very poor understanding of what deficits are. He keeps insisting that he has a deficit with Canada, when in fact that is not true. And in terms of China, it is not as simplistic as he thinks. There are over $350 billion a year that is being sold in China, but produced in China by U.S. companies. That is also under threat. When you start putting it all together, what you have is actually a fairly even trade balance. China has only about $10 billion worth of things that it produces in the U.S. and sells in the U.S. So it's not going to be this one-sided idea that he has, that he can sort of force doing this kind of bully playground idea.
Well, I mean, he seems to see a trade deficit as somehow a loss of American income, which it isn't. I mean, the main reason, and he seems to see it as a sign of that others are trading unfairly, and that's not necessarily true either. I mean, the main reason why the US has a trade deficit is because it doesn't save enough, and that is something which his own irresponsible fiscal policy is only going to make worse. And in terms of the trading relationship, well, one of the reasons why there is such a big the US has such a big trade deficit with China, according to the official figures, is because there are many parts and components which are assembled into finished products in China and then shipped to the US. And therefore, in the trade statistics, they count as an entirely Chinese export. But in the case, for example, of the iPhone, which is merely assembled in China, the value added that actually comes from China is roughly about 6%. Now, that's an extreme example, but it tells you actually the deficit is smaller than he says it is. More importantly, you know, a bilateral trade deficit with China in and of itself is not a problem.
Let's start with how all of this will affect the average American.
Prices are going up. Everything that you buy that's going to be imported is going to go up 10 to 25%. That's already happened with steel and aluminum. And when you get a Harley Davidson motorcycle or whatever, anything we are importing, the price is going to go up. We talked about a 20% tariff on any cars imported from Mexico, for example.
Right.
So Europe, Canada, Mexico, and then China's coming next.
Right.
So for U.S. consumers, we're the ones paying the bill.
And sure enough, prices are going up a lot. So far this spring, they've spiked 17%. And it's not just foreign washers that are more expensive now. Whirlpool has raised prices too. It blames higher costs, but as Sumaya Keynes points out,
the whole point of this tariff is to give the domestic industry relief. So if it works, then Whirlpool is supposed to be able to increase their prices and profits. The whole point is that they've been injured by this foreign competition, and this is supposed to let them get back to financial strength.
So if prices go up, that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
But it means consumers are worse off because they're now paying more.
Because this is really going to hurt American multinationals. Say you're Boeing and you sell 25% of your jets to China, or Caterpillar, or 3M, or all kinds of companies. If we have embargoes and higher tariffs, that is disastrous for these companies.
So U.S. manufacturers and U.S. agriculturalists, the very people that this policy is meant to help, are coming out against it?
Correct. So agriculture is our biggest thing. For example, soybeans. We export $14 billion worth of soybeans to China. Some ships with soybeans going other are already being turned around because they're going to refuse accepting those soybeans. That's hurting American farmers right in the core of Trump's support in the Middle West. Just like Ben Sasse, lots of other agricultural senators are going to say, wait a minute, don't hurt our farmers.
People who are really going to come out worse from this are American consumers, including the US military. I mean, they're importing a lot of steel for the US defense budget from South Korea. And one of the reasons that Trump has given for this policy is strategic defense reasons. It's so dumb, it just doesn't add up. And so in terms of proportionate responses from the EU and China and so on, I would argue, and a lot of my colleagues would argue, that it would be equally dumb for the EU to impose tariffs on things like Harley Davidson motorbikes, because again, the people who come out worst of that are the consumers. It's been calculated, for example, that for every one job saved by this tariff imposition for steel and aluminium in the United States, the US economy will actually lose 5 jobs. That adds up to 146,000 jobs that are at risk because of this policy by Trump.
What Trump is doing is the opposite of all the protectionist logic that every country has followed. The whole idea of protectionism is to increase your expensive, high-technology manufacturers by getting low raw materials. Trump's doing the opposite. He's raised aluminum and prices by 40% in the last month, 60% since the summer. Steel prices are up 33%. So this is going to squeeze the prices that manufacturers have to pay that make things out of aluminum and steel. There's no increase in tariffs on buying foreign tin cans or foreign steel products, so the American manufacturers will be squeezed, but foreign countries now have a great benefit. Germany, China, other countries are thinking, now, under the rules of international trade, when there is an illegal tariff put on, we get to retaliate. And they're going to look around and say, what do we want to respond to? What is the major American competition that we want to knock off the table? And they're going to put tariffs on whatever they think the competition is, whether it's Boeing airplanes or bourbon or blue jeans or other things. So what Trump's policy does is a travesty of protectionism. It merely squeezes. And the pretense of all of this is that if he gives more money to the steel and aluminum companies, they'll invest more and hire more labor. But they're not going to do that at all. Not a single new steel factory is going to be built. Not a single new aluminum factory, because aluminum is made out of electricity. And America is a high-cost electricity country compared to Iceland, where Alcan produces much of its aluminum in Canada. So what you're doing is enabling the steel and the aluminum companies to use their increased profits for share buybacks and to pay dividends, but they're not going to build new factories. There's not going to be any trickle down. So Trump has made a travesty out of protectionist doctrine as well.
I mean, I think the big problem is that, Trump is so erratic. He says one thing and then the next day he says another. So there's very little incentive for anyone actually to negotiate earnestly with him. Why make any kind of concession if either A, he'll go back on it the next day, or B, he'll come asking for more very soon. And so I think that what's much more likely now is that we're going to see escalation. And the Chinese have time on their side. They can afford to bide their time. Ultimately, Trump faces difficult midterm elections later in the year. He faces a difficult re-election in 2020. The Chinese don't face, obviously, electoral pressure, and they can afford to suck up the pressure and just and allow him to wear himself out.
So I think there are no illusions here, but you have to keep in mind, we're talking about China now, but this has now become a concert. The U.S. has become a rogue state. In essence, all of its chief trade partners have said that we're going to impose countervailing duties against you. This is not something that's going to go well. As soon as you have a chorus of no's, it's easier to add your voice to that chorus, and that's exactly what Trump has put in play.
I mean, the irony, of course, is that, it was past American presidents who created the multilateral trading system, and they saw it as an extension of American power, an extension of American prosperity. And normally, when hegemons decline, they try to extend the period for which they are powerful. And it would be in America's interest to try and preserve the system that it's created in its own image, and therefore prolong its power. And instead of that, Donald Trump has taken a completely different approach, which is to say, actually, we've been cheated, and I'm going to blow up the system. And insofar as there's a logic to it, it's that if we negotiate with countries bilaterally, America is top dog and will be able to get a better deal. And the fact is that one, you need allies. The United States would be much more effective in negotiating with China if it did it with allies. And secondly, his own negotiating strategy of being so erratic, of changing his mind all the time, means that nobody actually is going to make the concessions that he's looking for.
It's not just Trump. You're talking about certain advisors, men like Peter Navarro, Stephen Miller, who do not see this in terms of a win-win economically. They see this as a win-lose. The United States versus China, the United States versus Europe, the United States versus Canada. And this new breed of protectionist, political as well as economic protectionist, even if they think that they're losing some support amongst other Americans, they simply will say fake news, fake media, liberals, and hope that that base gets them through whatever economic damage the rest of us may suffer.